pulling our weight the same. Mic test, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sitting further away. Testing, mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If you push one in though, you might have to put it louder. Yeah, but the buzz is still there. Oh, okay.
Sound check for the court reporter, sitting back in my chair, testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Sound check for the court reporter. I was on, good. No buzzing or anything? But I can hear the audios real good. Okay.
Member mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, testing.
We'll call this hearing to order. Today we look at U.S. policy toward Latin America and toward the Caribbean. Our relationships in the Western Hemisphere are forged by deep cultural and economic ties. We export a lot of goods to the Caribbean, and that supports many U.S. jobs. Across Latin America, our trade ties are just as strong. But today, as the region faces urgent challenges and transitions, the United States must be more engaged than ever. As always, the safety of Americans serving abroad is a top priority for this committee. The still unexplained attacks on embassy personnel in Havana and now in China are very disturbing. 26 Americans have been medically evacuated from Havana with serious symptoms including sharp ear pain, headaches, vertigo, and other conditions consistent with brain injury or concussion. Canadians have been impacted as well. We need to know what happened, who is responsible, and how to respond. The administration is actively addressing the Western Hemisphere's major crisis, starting with Venezuela. The United States has repeatedly condemned the illegitimate election of President Maduro, as well as the human rights abuses and economic meltdown unfolding there. The administration has rightly deployed targeted sanctions, hitting Venezuelan officials responsible for this catastrophe, not the suffering Venezuelan people, is the way to go. The Vice President has traveled to the region 3 times to urge regional leaders to do more for the Venezuelan people. In Nicaragua, the administration has rightly designated 3 top officials for human rights abuses and for corruption. But we should do more to support the Nicaraguan people. The repressive Ortega regime has killed more than 200 advocates for free and fair elections since this April. One of the civilians murdered on a village street was a former neighbor of an Orange County friend of mine. Subcommittee Chairman Paul Cook will convene a hearing to further examine this matter tomorrow. Across the hemisphere, transnational criminal organizations continue to pose a major threat. These violent gangs are fueling the drug and migration crisis that the United States struggles with today. As we fight the deadly impacts of opium in our communities, we must continue working closely with our regional neighbors to increase counter-narcotics cooperation. The recent increase in cocaine production in Colombia is unacceptable, and I am hopeful that the election of President Ivan Duque is a sign that the country will redouble efforts to confront gangs and the cartels. This committee continues to support U.S. efforts to work with the countries of Central America's Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, to help shore up institutions, combat crime and combat corruption, and create conditions that will keep people from migrating north. I agree with the administration that combating corruption in the region must be a key part of the strategy to create opportunity and stability. The committee will continue to support assistance to the region. Finally, the recent election in Mexico raises questions about the future of the U.S.-Mexico security relationship under the Madeira Initiative. I hope that President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador's campaign promise to root out corruption is a sign that our 2 countries can continue to cooperate on matters of security. One of those is the Madeira Initiative, and we'll hear more from you on this. The U.S. and Mexico share a 2,000-mile border and must continue to work together to enhance both security and trade that benefits both our countries. NAFTA should be updated for the 21st century, not scrapped. And with that, let me go to our ranking member, Mr. Engel of New York, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling today's hearing. This region is particularly important to me as a former Western Hemisphere Subcommittee Chair. Ambassador Merton, Assistant Ambassador Lynch, welcome and thank you both for your service. You're both doing great work. But again, I must say the White House's failure to fill key positions in a timely manner means we cannot hear from those setting the course for foreign policy. That's too bad because, in my view, the administration has put us on a very dangerous course when it comes to the Western Hemisphere. The way the President talks about this region says it all, falsely insisting Mexico will pay for a border wall we don't need, the ugly language calling Mexicans drug dealers and rapists, the dehumanizing language about immigrants, and characterization of Haiti and El Salvador using a word I won't repeat. Democrats and Republicans have worked for 2 decades together to improve a U.S.-Mexico relationship long characterized by mistrust. Bilateral cooperation on counter-narcotics was once unimaginable. Amazingly, it became the norm, with the Mexican government extraditing the world's most dangerous drug kingpin, Chapo Guzman, to the United States in the last hours of the Obama administration. On July 1st, Mexicans elected a new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I worry that if President Trump continues along the same lines, President-elect López Obrador may pull the plug on security cooperation. Where would that leave us the next time we're seeking an extradition? Or if terrorists sought to cross the U.S.-Mexican border? Too much is at stake in our bilateral relationship, and we simply don't know if the President will continue to do this, take to Twitter, and do damage. And looking south, Mexico is just the start. For months, the families have been torn apart, and Central American children essentially have been held ransom to a radical anti-immigrant agenda. The President created this policy. He then said only Congress could fix it, which wasn't true, made clear by the fact that he then signed an executive order trying to end the policy. But the damage was done. Children to this day still remain apart from their parents. That has to change. The Organization of American States unanimously adopted a resolution on June 29th criticizing the inhumane family separation policy. It's hard to remember a time in recent memory when the OAS Permanent Council has so forcefully condemned the United States, and that's just the start. The administration is making it harder for victims of abuse to come to the United States, saying domestic violence shouldn't be grounds for asylum, that women and children who have endured rape and other forms of violence should look elsewhere for sanctuary. The United States also just opposed a UN resolution promoting breastfeeding. I mean, it's unbelievable, and I fear the worst is yet to come. Temporary protected status will soon end for 262,000 Salvadorans, 86,000 Hondurans, and 58,000 Haitians. As Mark Schneider of CSIS pointed out in the Washington Post this week, this move may result in 273,000 American-born children being separated from their parents. This is a deeply troubling pattern dealing with the treatment of women, of families, of immigrants. Is this what we're becoming as a country? I hope not. I won't accept it, and I'll fight tooth and nail against these policies that betray our values and make it harder to advance our interests abroad. After all, we're facing very real and urgent crises in the region. President Maduro has turned Venezuela into a full-fledged dictatorship and rejected humanitarian aid. State Department sanctions against human rights violators were a step forward. But instead of working with regional partners, we have, again, bellicose rhetoric and threatening to invade Venezuela. The result, Maduro is empowered and alienated key allies at the same time. In Nicaragua, the global Magnitsky Act has allowed us to crack down on thugs tied to President Ortega who are killing innocent people in the streets. Yet the administration zeroed out democracy assistance to Nicaragua in its 2019 budget. And in Guatemala, absurd and unfounded attacks on the UN International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, what we call CICIG, threaten the institution's ability to fight corruption and support the rule of law. Most recently, I was disturbed by the Guatemalan government's decision to put CICIG personnel at risk, removing a large portion of their security detail. President Morales should immediately reverse this decision. And I must say, since I've been critical of the White House, this time I was pleased that the White House came out in strong support of CICIG just this week. I congratulate Ivan Duque on his recent victory election in Colombia. Outgoing U.S. assistance is essential for implementing the peace process and supporting smart drug policies that go after kingpins while not harming small farmers or the environment. And in Argentina, I was glad to join Mr. McCall in founding the Argentina Caucus to focus on a relationship that has improved a great deal since President Macri took office. Finally, the Caribbean. In 2016, Congresswoman Ross Layton and I authored the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act, which President Obama signed into law in his last few days in office. Last June, the State Department released a strategy mandated by our law. It is an ambitious and impressive strategy, but unfortunately, 1 year later, it still has not been implemented. With hurricane season underway, the parts of the strategy related to disaster preparedness and resilience are especially urgent. I implore our witnesses to put some meat on the bones of what on paper is an excellent strategy. And I'd be remiss not to mention that Haiti is very much on my mind this week. Haiti has suffered far more than any country should, and I stand with the Haitian people at this difficult moment. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. So this morning, we're pleased to be joined by Ken Merton, Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and Sarah Ann Lynch, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID for Latin America and the Caribbean. We welcome them to the committee. Ambassador Merton has been serving as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs since August of 2015. He is a two-time ambassador, having served as the U.S. Ambassador to Croatia and also as the U.S. Ambassador to Haiti. Ms. Sarah Ann Lynch currently serves as Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID, and prior to that, she was the Mission Director in Iraq. So we appreciate them both being with us here today, and without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record, and members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. So if you could, Ambassador, I'd ask you to just summarize your statement in 5 minutes, and each of you, and then we'll go to questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to allow us to come here and talk a little bit about the administration's approach to our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. We know that a democratic, prosperous, and secure Western Hemisphere enhances our national security and benefits our economy. Our policies are built upon that premise. The United States shares common values and has strong economic bonds with all the countries in this region. These long historical connections bind us to the nations of the Western Hemisphere more closely than in any other region. Our economic engagement with the Americas cannot be overstated. The United States is the top trading partner for more than half the countries in the region. We trade more than twice as much with the hemisphere as we do, for example, with China. We also share fundamental values. In the last decades, Latin America has largely transformed itself into a region of vibrant, peaceful democracies. The United States recently reaffirmed its commitment to these shared values and to our partnership with the region at the 8th Summit of the Americas in Lima, Peru in May. At that summit, leaders acknowledged the need to continue working together to address corruption, to strengthen institutions, and to improve transparency. We rely on strong hemispheric partnerships to fight transnational criminal organizations, and we work hand in hand with our partners to disrupt illicit networks and trafficking routes. Because our mutual security and prosperity are so connected, we work together to counter the illicit activity and the poverty that drive illegal immigration to the United States. As such, the U.S., together with our partners, is renewing its commitment to address the root causes of Central American migration. While most of the region enjoys democratic rule, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua continue to undermine the region's shared vision for effective democratic governance enshrined in the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The United States remains committed to standing with the people of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela in their struggle to achieve the liberty that they deserve. In Cuba, The regime continues its repressive hold on power despite the recent transition to President Diaz-Canel. President Trump's June 2017 Cuba policy emphasizes advancing human rights and democracy and aims to ensure that the benefits of U.S. engagement flow to the Cuban people. In Nicaragua, we condemn the violence and excessive force used against demonstrators, resulting in 215 deaths and hundreds more wounded since protests began now in mid-April. We urge Nicaragua's government to strengthen democratic processes and institutions and to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms and support the proposal for free and fair elections that would occur as soon. In Venezuela, the Maduro regime has completely undermined democracy. We join the nations of the world in standing with the Venezuelan people as they seek to return to a stable, prosperous democracy they deserve. We are also addressing the humanitarian component of the Venezuelan crisis by supporting Venezuelans who are deprived, suffering, and increasingly forced to flee their homes. Overall, the United States is providing nearly $31 million in humanitarian assistance to Venezuelans in the region. We will continue to work with our partners to help restore democracy to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, and we will continue to build a democratic, prosperous, and secure Western Hemisphere that further enhances our own national security and benefits our economy. So I look forward to your questions today. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ms. Lynch.
Thank you. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. I had the distinct pleasure of traveling with some of you recently while Administrator Green and I were in Peru at the Summit of the Americas in April, and thank you so much for your continued interest in our work in the region. USAID's engagement in Latin America and the Caribbean advances U.S. national security and economic prosperity, demonstrates American generosity, and promotes a path to recipient self-reliance and resilience. This is a region with considerable opportunities, but also critical challenges. USAID works to increase the security and prosperity of the hemisphere by addressing issues of poverty, insecurity, and governance. For example, our work in Mexico and Central America responds to challenges that inhibit business development, empower criminals, and lead to outmigration. Recent high levels of illegal migration from Central America come largely as a result of poverty, instability, and weak governance, including high levels of corruption and impunity. Therefore, USAID's programs focus on engaging young people before they turn to crime and violence, improving democratic governance, and addressing the economic conditions that drive people to make the perilous journey north. In Mexico, we partner with the government to strengthen national institutions, spread the rule of law, and promote the protection of human rights. And together with Mexico, we're working closely with the Northern Triangle governments to address those challenges to security and prosperity that we collectively face. Two of our primary areas of focus in South America are Colombia and Peru. These countries are making enormous economic and social strides, but remain plagued by coca cultivation, which enriches transnational criminal organizations that threaten regional security. In Colombia, USAID is working in some of the most dangerous and hard-to-reach areas, which were cut off from state presence for decades during the conflict. Our efforts to reduce the power and influence of illegal armed groups, build a culture of legality, expand state presence in former conflict areas, and enable licit rural economic growth are seeing promising results. Similarly, in Peru, USAID assistance helps to reduce the flow of illicit drugs by providing farmers with alternatives to coca cultivation, and the achievements are impressive. As the third border to the United States, the Caribbean remains vital to American security and prosperity. I would like to thank Ranking Member Engel and Ms. Ross-Lehtinen for their continued interest and engagement on Caribbean topics, and especially for authoring H.R. 4939, which helps lead the U.S. strategy for engagement in the Caribbean. Under the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, CBSI, we are working to improve citizen security and provide employment and education opportunities to youth at risk of joining gangs and other transnational criminal organizations. We are also working with countries across the Caribbean to increase resilience so that they are better able to withstand shocks such as tropical storms and hurricanes. Haiti remains a focus for our work in the Caribbean, where we are addressing poverty, promoting good governance, improving health, and advancing transparent and accountable government institutions. However, as this weekend's violence has demonstrated, Haiti's progress and stability continues to be fragile.
And unfortunately, Haiti is not the only place in the region where we have seen violence and instability recently. We are very concerned for the people of Nicaragua who are suffering a brutal crackdown at the hands of the Ortega government. USAID has given rapid assistance to the brave civil society groups, human rights organizations, independent media, and others involved in peaceful protest. And we remain flexible to respond to needs as they emerge. USAID also helps to maintain an operating space for those in Cuba who seek to preserve their basic freedoms of speech, religion, assembly, and democratic voice. But one of our most pressing priorities in the region right now is the outflow of Venezuelans who are fleeing their country in record numbers in search of food, medicine, and health care. To help these families who have fled to neighboring countries, USAID has partnered with these countries to provide humanitarian and development assistance to meet the most urgent needs. And while humanitarian assistance will help with immediate needs, it will not and cannot address the root causes of Venezuela's instability. Only lasting political and economic reforms will provide sustainable solutions. To help the Venezuelan people maintain their voice, USAID supports human rights, civil society, independent media, electoral oversight, and the elected National Assembly. In this discussion, I cannot overlook the rise in competing foreign engagement in the region. We recognize that some countries have different development models than ours, but we believe we offer the clear choice. For example, where other countries' assistance models may further dependence, our development assistance promotes a country's own journey consistent with U.S.-supported universal values and interests, bolstering our partners' self-reliance and prosperity. To accomplish our goals, we coordinate and leverage the work of the U.S. interagency, other donors, the private sector, faith-based communities, and non-governmental organizations. In all of our work, we are committed to oversight and ensure that our programs are smart and impactful. We use a range of tools, such as monitoring, surveys, evaluations, and assessments, to understand the effects of our programs and help us capture changes at the community or other subnational levels. We know very well our responsibility to the American taxpayer, and we take our obligation very seriously. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, I want to thank you and the committee for the opportunity to give an overview of our work, and I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
If I could begin with this question, we've got 26 U.S. diplomats and their family members who have suffered symptoms similar to brain injury or concussion following sonic attacks in Cuba. And we have another 3 officials now in China who have suffered similar symptoms. In response to the attacks, the State Department ordered the departure of non-essential personnel and their families in Havana. 60% of the U.S. mission diplomats in Cuba have been withdrawn. Other than the Canadian mission in Havana, where the Canadians report 10 of their diplomats were targeted, have any other embassies been affected, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Chairman. This is something which is very worrisome to us, but we're not aware of any other embassies at this point.
What is the health condition of the U.S. diplomats and the family members affected by these unexplained attacks at this point?
Well, I think you covered it very well in your opening remarks. The health effects differ from person to person. Some are more serious on some individuals. On some individuals, they're less serious. But the bottom line is the impact of these attacks on folks is serious, which is why they were withdrawn, and we've gone down to a skeleton crew at the embassy there.
And the last question I'd ask you on this is, how close is the administration to understanding and identifying the source and cause of these attacks?
Well, we have taken this, as I mentioned, very seriously, both in the Cuba context and in the China context, which is frankly still very much evolving. Bottom line answer is we don't know who is responsible, and we don't know what is responsible for this. We have various investigations ongoing. The FBI is involved. The CDC is involved in looking at this. We have we have employees who are being looked at by outside medical care, but we are still unsure exactly what it is these people have been afflicted with.
We go to a question about the crisis in Venezuela. which is worsening. While President Maduro further cemented his power with sham elections this past May, we've seen the situation on the streets there, and especially the widespread food and medicine shortages that continue to displace Venezuelans, that create a regional crisis, refugee crisis, as well as a humanitarian crisis, obviously. And meanwhile, despite sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, Venezuelan oil production has fallen by half in the last few years. Venezuela, in the meantime, has been sending several 100,000 barrels of oil every day to China as repayment on the tens of billions of dollars it has borrowed. And more recently, China's Development Bank announced a new $250 million investment to shore up Venezuela's struggling oil production. Is the administration concerned about China's economic stranglehold on Venezuela? And is China using Venezuela as a foothold to gain influence in the rest of the region?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chairman. It's not clear that China is necessarily using Venezuela as a foothold. Our information indicates that the Venezuelan economy still continues to crater, if you excuse my using that term. Oil production continues to go down. The national oil company, PDVSA, has been plagued by mismanagement, by political hacks replacing people who knew what they were doing, and the company continues to deteriorate, and thus robbing the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan government of what should be a very valuable source of income for them. We are obviously watching very carefully what China does throughout the hemisphere, and we monitor that very carefully. We're concerned about the role they play. We believe we are a much better partner for all our friends in the hemisphere. We share values, we share goals, and it's not clear to us that the Chinese government or entities operating overseas share the same goals as our friends in the hemisphere.
Well, let me ask a question of Ms. Lynch in terms of the greatest health concerns that are caused by the crisis in Venezuela and by the refugee crisis, and what is being done, for example, to ensure vaccinations and other medicines are made available, because there's widespread shortage throughout Venezuela right now on the vaccinations.
Right, thank you for the question. Yes, we are also deeply disturbed by all the images and the news reports coming out of Venezuela. As such, we have been able to identify, as the ambassador said, several millions of dollars of assistance that's going to the almost 2 million Venezuelans that have fled that country in search of very basic needs like food, medicine, and health care. And Colombia obviously is taking the brunt of the movement of people. I myself was up on the border not too long ago in Cucuta and witnessed firsthand the Venezuelans crossing the Simón Bolívar Bridge, and it's very disturbing. The bulk of our assistance to the Colombians is in those areas, food, medicine, and healthcare, but also to help them manage the crossing of the great number of people. We're also assisting Brazil in the region. And in addition, we were able to get an assessment team, USAID assessment team, into Venezuela in order to get the context on the ground and do a full assessment. And this was a team that spent nearly 2 weeks there, did not just stay in Caracas, but they went throughout the country and they visited schools, they visited clinics, they talked to NGOs, they talked to the private sector, church, they talked to, as well as organizations, civil society organizations that could provide humanitarian assistance at scale. One issue that we found is that they lack capacity. So what USAID is doing to respond right now is training these organizations to be able to provide humanitarian assistance at scale. So to deal with the logistics involved in that kind of effort and to identify the truly at-risk people. So with that, we will be able to address the concerns that you mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nothing can quite make people understand the horrors that are occurring in our own country as a consequence of the President's family separation policy than hearing the individual stories of Central American children. So I'd like to briefly talk about Jose, Olivia, and their sons, Mateo and Andre, who came to the U.S. from El Salvador seeking refuge from gang violence and extortion. A close friend was killed by the same gang threatening Jose and Olivia when he was unable to pay them. So fearing for their lives and the lives of their children, Jose and Olivia joined a caravan of asylum seekers and traveled for a month through Mexico to reach the border. Upon arrival, they presented their papers and their children's birth certificates, proving their familial relationship to avoid agent suspicion that Jose was a smuggler paired with children that were not his. Regardless, U.S. authorities separated the family and sent Mateo, only 1 year old at the time, to a facility 1,500 miles away. Olivia and Andre awaited news of Mateo's status from a migrant shelter in Mexico. When Olivia called the facility where Mateo was being held, she was told he was doing fine with no further information on his well-being, and certainly they wouldn't allow her to speak with her son. She was reunited with Mateo finally after 85 days. According to her testimony, she said that after reuniting with her toddler, quote, "He continued to cry when we got home, and he would hold on to my leg and would not let me go. When I took off his clothes, he was full of dirt and lice. It seemed like they had not bathed him in the 85 days he was away from us," and that's a quote. Obviously, this is child abuse. It's unconscionable and should not have happened. So I recently introduced the Central America Family Protection and Reunification Act with Representatives Torres and Espaillat, who are both members of this committee. And this would require the State Department, through our embassies in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, to play a much more active role in supporting Central American governments and parents on family reunification. Ambassador Merton, let me ask you, can you please tell us what our embassies in these countries are doing to support family reunification, if anything?
Thanks for the question, Representative Engel. What we are doing in Central America, we have a Central America strategy which seeks to get at the root causes of migration, to hopefully give people less of a reason to want to leave their country in the first place. And our efforts have been really focused on implementing that strategy, particularly in the Northern Triangle. We're looking at using tools to eliminate corruption that allow a climate of impunity for those who seek to abuse people. We are supporting law enforcement activities through our partners in the region. We are working to help them improve their judicial systems so that criminals can be put away in a clear and transparent way according to local laws. We are working to help these countries grow their economies. And we believe that addressing these issues will really obviate the need for these kind of, that drive people to want to leave their countries and force them into situations like you just described.
But our embassies, specifically, our embassies helping to reunite families, are embassies playing any role in that, in the reunification?
You know, at the risk of misleading you, I'd rather take that question back and get back with an answer to you. I don't want to give you an answer which is incorrect.
Thank you, because that's what our bill, our legislation does. It involves the embassies, which makes sense to me, because anything we can do to help expedite this would be good. Ms. Lynch, our legislation also requires a State Department strategy to address pervasive gender-based violence in the Northern Triangle. Can you please describe the impact of gender-based violence, and specifically domestic violence, on women in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras?
Thank you for the question. Yes, all of our activities in the Northern Triangle are based at focusing on the root causes of illegal migration. And certainly we work on the security front as well as governance and prosperity. So this would fall into that security front and governance as well, whereby we just find the gender-based violence The rates that you see in the Northern Triangle are just horrific. So what we do is we incorporate women as well as other marginalized communities that suffer as well at higher rates than others of violence. We incorporate them into all of our programming, and that means on the governance front, making sure there's legislation that addresses these issues. On the citizen front, making sure that there's citizen awareness and that there is the capacity of certain civil society organizations to address those issues. And in addition, prosperity, economic opportunity is really what gives these women power and control over their lives. So specifically with all of our programming that involves increased jobs and economic growth, we involve women in marginalized communities to the fullest extent.
Well, thank you. Let me just say that given the pervasiveness of domestic violence in the Northern Triangle and the low rates of prosecution for these horrific crimes, it's really horrifying that Attorney General Sessions says he'll no longer allow these crimes to be grounds for asylum. I just think that's a very bad thing. And finally, let me piggyback on the chairman has talked a lot about Cuba and our embassy officials being targeted. One of the things that I've called for is to have the CDC, to involve the CDC, why has the administration, referring to the health, well, let me just say this, why has not the CDC yet been deployed to Cuba? It certainly seems to me that we should, if we're really going to get to the bottom of it, and I just don't understand why that hasn't happened. Does anyone have any insight into that for me?
Thanks very much. Yes, one of the things that we have done in the past month or so is the Secretary Pompeo has asked that Deputy Secretary Sullivan chair a task force to look at these incidents, both in China and the attacks in Cuba. And this task force is chaired by the Deputy Secretary. He participates in it. I participate in it, representing the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. We also have once a week a meeting of the task force with the interagency community. And in that community, CDC is present. And they are an active member of that community, of the interagency community that participates in this task force. I don't know if they have plans to travel yet, but I think their involvement in this is relatively recent. But I think there's a possibility that they could become more involved. Wouldn't be appropriate for me to really explain what their plans are to do, but they are participating now in this interagency task force. So as I said, we remain very concerned about this, and I think we're looking for any tools we can find to really get to the bottom of what's causing this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, and Mr. Engel and I are going to be meeting with Deputy Secretary Sullivan this afternoon at 4 o'clock, so we'll raise that issue, Ambassador, with him as well at that time. We'll go now to Eliana Ross-Leitonen.
Thank you so much, Chairman Royce. Thank you, Ranking Member Engel, for once again holding a hearing on a very timely and important topic. Since widespread protests began on April 18th in Nicaragua, we have seen over 300 people killed under the direction of Daniel Ortega and his henchmen. In Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro continues to rule with impunity, ignoring the pleas of the Venezuelan people for new leadership. In my native homeland of Cuba, Raúl Castro continues to call the shots as head of the Communist Party, all the while hiding behind the veil of the so-called transition of power. Under Díaz-Canel, nada has changed for the people of Cuba. Activists are still being held for days at a time. Las Damas de Blanco are still being beaten and arrested, and the regime continues to rule with an iron fist. More worrisome, Mr. Chairman, is that cooperation between these rogue regimes has actually increased. Just last week, there were reports indicating that Maduro had sent a shipment of weapons to Ortega to help him further suppress and silence the Nicaraguan people. Instead of using the country's resources to alleviate the Venezuelan people's suffering he caused for his failed policies, he sends weapons to his crony, making him complicit in the deaths of so many in Nicaragua. But this U.S. administration has shown a willingness to lead and hold those abusers accountable, in stark contrast to the previous administration. And I thank our witnesses here for explaining all that has happened. We've seen a reversal of the disastrous Cuba policy. We've seen a more active use of sanctions, particularly the global Magnitsky sanctions in Nicaragua and targeted sanctions against the Maduro regime in Venezuela. On 2 occasions, I have led letters urging sanctions on several Nicaraguan regime officials for their roles in the human rights abuses being perpetrated against the people of Nicaragua. The administration has included most of these individuals on the global Magnitsky list, but I intend on sending another letter shortly with more names. And the administration has begun to provide assistance to Venezuelans who have fled to neighboring countries and has signaled that it will make freedom and democracy in the region a priority. But more must be done. And you had explained, Ms. Lynch, about what the administration and specifically USAID has been doing to support the Venezuelan refugees who are in Colombia and Brazil. I wanted to ask you about Ecuador. What help is being given to the Venezuelans there? The Vice President Pence was just there. So what more can be done? And secondly, I worry about China's growing presence and influence in the entire region, using its resources to bully nations, to further isolate our strong ally, Taiwan. And what is the administration's strategy then to counter Chinese aggression, to help Taiwan strengthen its relationship with its partners in the region? Thanks again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, some small-scale assistance was requested from Ecuador from the U.S. interagency, and that is being provided. And we stand ready to assist other nations if they are interested in additional assistance. We know this is a horrific regional problem that may impact other nations in the region, other strong partners of ours. Regarding, from our perspective on the development side, on China, for example, what, from AID's vantage point, we believe that our work in building strong institutions in the region, as well as promoting strong economic investment, particularly from the U.S., are good antidotes to the influence of nations that have a different development model than we do. Some of these other donors, as I mentioned in my opening, are more their development model is one more of dependence rather than one of partnership. Ours is a partnership where we look to, work with partners who are self-reliant eventually.
Thank you.
And we look forward to working with you in that
Thank you,
area.
Ms. Lynch. Mr. Ambassador? Thank you.
Just to talk briefly about the China, influence of China in the hemisphere again. Yes, it is something, as I mentioned earlier, that we are concerned about and watching very carefully. We regularly talk to our partners in the region. I have done so myself to explain what it really means to sign up with to some of the blandishments of the PRC in terms of loans and other things. These are things that we've seen in the recent past that don't necessarily help these countries out in the long term. They may be quick political fixes, but I think we are trying to explain and in very clear terms that it makes more sense for long-term development of all our partners in the region to focus on rules-based and normal economic development. Our assistance programs in the region seek to support rule of law and governance and to make these countries better places to live, better places to do business, and thus ultimately reduce migration. But it's an issue that we continue to work very, very diligently on and are paying close attention to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Eliana. We go to Brad Sherman of California.
Mr. Chairman, we have a knowledgeable witness here, but he is as I understand it, acting principal deputy assistant secretary. We used to have undersecretaries and assistant secretaries come here. They may not have been more knowledgeable, but they were higher ranking in the State Department. The administration took over a year to appoint an assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere, and a Republican Senate still hasn't acted to confirm. The administration is hollowing out the State Department, and I think we as a practice should be compelling the testimony of those at the National Security Advisor's Office and Council. If you're going to hollow out the State Department, then if we're going to oversee foreign policy, we have to have those witnesses. I had a chance to visit the kids who were separated by the United States at the border. I want to commend the State Department for its 2018 Trafficking in Persons report, which identified and condemned foreign governments for separating children from their families, and relate the story of one particular family. Jose and his son Brian arrived in California from Honduras, my state, in May. Brian's mother had been raped and brutally murdered. She was 7 months pregnant at the time. Jose and Brian thought that they might face a similar outcome. Jose was jailed for 20 days and asked to sign papers he couldn't understand because they were in English, deported back to Honduras. This after Brian, the son, had been separated from his father. There are news reports that say that this whole process at least began, it seems now they're walking it back, as an effort to deter immigration from Central America. Has there been any effort of the State Department to try to tell people in Central America, don't come to the United States, we will treat you harshly, separate families, deport you, et cetera? Ambassador?
Thanks for the question. You know, what we do tell people is to not make a journey that is dangerous or illegal. We have always encouraged legal, orderly migration of people, legal and orderly travel of people. So that is what we've been focusing on.
I want to move on to one other issue, Ecuador. Julian Assange is in their embassy in London. He is wanted by law enforcement authorities in both Britain and Sweden. One thing we know about Julian Assange is that he did collude with Russia to use cyber files stolen from the Democratic National Committee to affect a U.S. election. And in 1972, when files were stolen from the Democratic National Committee, members of Congress from both parties condemned that action. We haven't put any pressure on Ecuador to turn out Mr. Assange, and I understood that to be because we had such respect for Ecuador's sovereignty. And then I find out in the New York Times that we threatened Ecuador with punishing trade measures and a withdrawal of critical military aid if they wouldn't withdraw their support for a World Health Organization resolution encouraging breastfeeding. Ambassador, can you, on the record, indicate that you know that these reports in the New York Times were false and that we did not threaten Ecuador on this issue?
My understanding from our ambassador and from my colleagues in the State Department, Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs that work on this issue on a regular basis is that we did not threaten anybody, that the U.S. supports breastfeeding.
But we don't support efforts at breastfeeding beyond what the companies that make billions of dollars on the formula industry by discouraging breastfeeding want us to do. We support only mild resolutions, and we force the World Health Organization to back down and adopt a milder resolution. But you're certain now that Ecuador can introduce the stronger resolution and there will be no diminution of trade or aid. Can Ecuador count on you for that?
I can tell you what has happened thus far, and my understanding.
Well, what is our policy? Is our policy to threaten Ecuador on this issue or to allow them to go forward?
My understanding is that there has been no threatening, and I do not believe that we.
So they're free to go forward, you guarantee it?
I am not here to guarantee that going
So
forward.
maybe
This
they
is
will be
not-
threatened, maybe they won't, they either have to believe.
They are not going to be threatened, sir, but I will say that this is.
They're not going to be
policy.
threatened.
This is a policy that we don't actually own.
And so the New York
our
Times
bureau.
reports are false?
As I understand, our ambassador and from the folks that work on this in our bureau, that nobody was threatened. We have not, threatened to pull trade sanctions or anything else on Ecuador. That is my understanding, sir.
Well, a lot of infants are going to get worse nutrition as a result of the successful efforts by the United States at the World Health Organization to water down this resolution. And I yield back.
Chris Smith
Thank
of
you.
New Jersey.
I appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you for your testimony to our two witnesses. On April 27th, I chaired a hearing on serious and credible allegations of collusion between CSIG and the Russian government in the persecution, mistreatment, and incarceration of a Russian family, the Bitkovs, who fled Russia after Putin's cronies threatened their lives, took away their business, and of course, the young daughter was raped. Anastasia, who obviously is still dealing with the aftermath of that. Our prime witness was Bill Browder, the main man whose tenacity, courage, and credibility led to at least an accountability of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. It is because of Bill Browder that we have the Magnitsky Act. It is because of Bill Browder that we have the Global Magnitsky Act. So when he speaks, everybody should listen and should listen very carefully. And I share his concerns about the Bitkovs. He is, let me just say to my colleagues, in 2013, the Russians fled, the Bitkovs fled, I should say, and finally got to Guatemala under an assumed name. They used documents that were not true, but again, for having documents that weren't true, and they are true refugees, the Palermo Protocol says you don't prosecute when somebody is fleeing tyranny and has a well-founded fear of persecution. Igor got 19 years in prison, Irina got 14 years, and Anastasia 14. Igor spent 3 years in pretrial detention, jail, in a very, very unseemly pattern that CSIG is a part of. Now, my question to our distinguished colleagues today is, one, have you investigated, and has there ever been, is there now any collusion whatsoever between VTB, Gazprom Bank, Spear Bank, or any other person associated with the Russian government, and CSIG, including Ivan Velasquez, on any matter relating to the prosecution and incarceration of the Bitkovs? Second, can you tell us what kind of information do you have? Is there any accountability? I've asked the Secretary General of the United Nations, Gutierrez, why aren't you looking into this? He said, we have no authority to do so. He told me that just a few weeks ago when I met with him. I am asking today, and I will do it by way of letter, that the Inspector General investigate the potential of collusion. My hope is that in answer to my question, you'll say that you have thoroughly investigated this and you either found it or you didn't, or to some degree there is some collusion. That's my opening questions, and I do have some further ones, but if you could answer that.
Thanks for the question. This is an issue that we follow closely. Our embassy and the department have looked into these allegations of collusion. Thus far, have found no evidence that has occurred.
Okay, let me say, no, could you give us a detail of what that investigation included? I mean, was it done just asking Mr. Velasquez and a few others, hey, is there collusion, or did you really dig into documents and look into this? I call your attention to this, and we'll give you a copy, an excellent piece that was put together by Mr. Bill Browder. This just reeks of collusion. So I would like to know exactly what that investigation entailed.
Sure, I would look forward to receiving that document, and I think if you allow us to get back to you with exactly what's been done, I think that'd be a more effective way of answering your question.
Is there any mechanism for holding CSIG to account? I mean, there's a hold on their $6 million now that has finally gotten their attention. 2 days before I had my hearing, the Constitutional Court found in their favor. Again, we're talking about 19 years, 14 years, 14 years. People don't get that many years for murder in Guatemala. And CICIG then appealed that ruling and is now, there's going to be another prosecution of at least Igor, which is absurd. I mean, if I was doing that with my family, and I would say the same to you, wouldn't you use every means possible to get out of a country that is going after you, hurting your daughter, putting you into prison, and maybe even killing you? We've learned that from Sergei Magnitsky, I thought, and many others. We called our hearing the long arm of the Russians. What kind of, let me ask you again, is there any kind of connection between CICIG and the Russians?
Again, thus far in our investigations, we've found no collusion between them.
And no contact, no cooperation?
From the information I've been given, we have not received that. We have not seen that. So that's that.
Maybe the IG will be able to
this-
ferret out more
we can-
information. Let me ask you about the Guatemalans who are held in pretrial. There is a dual national from Jersey City, Anthony Segura, 3 years in pretrial detention. I know, and I've been in Congress 38 years, Mr. Chairman, and I know, and I've been to places like Bolivia where they use prosecution as a way of getting political retribution, and certainly Evo Morales does it better than anybody else on earth. What is your view about these pretrial detentions that go on for years with CICIG's full complicity in that?
Well, pretrial detention is a problem in a number of countries throughout the hemisphere. It's something that, we work at in our rule of law programs to get countries to establish mechanisms to reduce or eliminate pretrial detention. I think our work in that area is certainly ongoing. So obviously, it's not a situation we like. We are working in a number of countries to help address that.
Let me just ask you finally, because my time is running out. Mary and Anastasia O'Grady from the Wall Street Journal, in her piece, and I invite members to read it, Guatemala, Russia, and the Bitkovs, the family remains in jeopardy thanks to a U.S.-funded rogue UN agency. She points out immediately after the High Court decision, CICIG apologists launched a full-scale press on Capitol Hill to cover up the UN agency's many transgressions. How do you respond to that?
I'm not aware of any such cover-up. If you would like to ask, we can get you more details on what we know on that. I'm not aware of that, sir.
So there's no cover-up?
I'm not aware of a cover-up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We share the concerns of Mr. Smith. This committee will continue to work with the Senate, the State Department, the USUN on reforms that will preserve the essential functions of CICIG while responding to legitimate criticisms of overreach. All right? We go now to Albio Ceres of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for hosting this full committee hearing on the Western Hemisphere. And I want to thank our panel that's here today. Thank you very much. I have this issue, excuse me, I have this issue over the last few years that I've been on the Western Hemisphere Committee, that we just don't focus enough on the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean. I think that while we sleep, there are people out there plotting. And basically, I'm talking about China, I'm talking about Russia, I'm talking even about Iran, who's now started with a couple of schools. Now they have over 100 schools throughout the area. And the signs are there. I mean, even in Venezuela, you have 30,000 Cubans basically running the show there. In Cuba, they started with the National Assembly, which basically destroyed all sorts of democracy or anything that was there. And then you have in Venezuela, you have the Constituent Assembly, which is basically the same thing, destroying any signs of democracy. Then you go to Nicaragua. You have the Russia selling them $80 million worth of tanks. And they're asking the people of Nicaragua to contribute more to the Social Security. I mean, the signs are there. And I don't know, what we do is basically insult some of these people in Central America, which makes your job a lot harder when you want to talk about democracy and talk about investment. I mean, where do we go from here? We got a new president in Mexico. I don't know how we deal with the new president of Mexico after all the insults that we have laid on the Mexican people. And before we know it, all these people are going to be in our backyard. All these countries that are plotting as we sleep. So I'm not all that bullish on this area. I see more and more democracies going down in the future. You have Venezuela, you have Nicaragua, you have some, to a certain degree, Ecuador, some of these other areas. So where do you see democracy in the area? Can you tell me about that?
Thanks for the question. I think we see the hemisphere largely united behind, as I said in my opening remarks, the Inter-American Democratic Charter. We've been working in the OAS. I think we've seen a pretty significant amount of support in the OAS to voice their opposition to undemocratic steps that are taken in countries like you've mentioned. I think that we continue to do work to promote civil society, to engage with civil society, and to enable opposition parties to have a voice. We have supported those people in Nicaragua who are calling for early elections. We've acknowledged that. So I think we're still working very diligently on this, but these are countries that, as several members already noted, that are not necessarily going to be, they're not squeamish about using repression as a way to stay in power.
I look at Nicaragua. We have a bill, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and I, the NICA bill. Basically, it doesn't allow them to take loans from international finance institutions. Why should we allow them to have loans from financial institutions when they go and spend $80 billion on Russian tanks to oppress their people? And yet some people here don't like to support something like that. I think we have to bring some sort of pressure on these governments to realize that you just can't run over people and just expect us, the United States, and not do anything, especially when it's our Western Hemisphere and our Caribbean. We really have to focus more on those areas.
Well, as you know, we have applied individual sanctions on members of the regime in Venezuela. We have applied the Global Magnitsky Act to 3 people in Nicaragua. We have, as I understand it, revoked 21 visas from government officials or officials who are responsible for these types of things. I think there's a possibility we could look at more of those kind of tools as well.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just note from some of the comments we've had so far that this condemnation of our president for the policies that we now have in terms of people who are coming to our country legally and separation of families, that let us just note that that policy was in place and put in place during the Obama administration. And I consider that singling out our president today is very political because I didn't hear any of the complaints coming from that side of the aisle during the Obama administration when the policies were exactly the same. With that said, I have somewhat of a disagreement over the idea of using the word migration. Maybe you could tell me, what is the population of Latin America?
I don't know off the top of my head.
You know what the population of Latin America is? Okay, well,
We can get that.
I think these are fundamentals that people need to know when they're talking about migration. We're not talking about 10 million people. We're not talking about 50 million people. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, are we not? And when you have societies like we see in Latin America and elsewhere in the world, I might add, but now we're focused on Latin America, where you have millions and millions of people living in countries that are somewhat chaotic and very clearly repressive. And let me identify myself with the remarks of Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and her concerns about Nicaragua and Venezuela, but those same type of repression can be found in other countries in Latin America as well. we do not have a policy, or do you believe that we should have a policy and labeling those people migrants who are, thus giving them some other definition rather than illegal entries or illegal immigrants into our country? You think that that should be open to hundreds of millions of people when they end up suffering under their own government?
Well, sir, our policy with Central America is to address the root causes that drive people
I understand
out of
that.
their
That's not my question, because I understand. That's a good point. I voted for NAFTA for that reason, because I felt making sure Mexico had a very good economy would take the pressure off of people coming here illegally. Okay, let me ask you this. How many people are are permitted to legally immigrate from those countries into the United States every year?
Sir, I don't have those figures. That's a DHS, Department of Homeland Security function.
So already we have, however, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I am assuming we're talking about millions of people over a 10-year period coming from that area legally into our country. We have, over a 10-year period, we permit more legal immigration into our country than all the rest of the countries of the world combined. And but what I'm worried about after hearing your testimony today and the use of the word migration is that in some way gives credence to the United States has to accept millions of more people into our country, over and above the million that we allow in already legally, which, as I say, is more than the rest of the world combined. Now, is there a limit that you think that we should have on people who are, you call it migration? Is there a limit on migration into our country?
My understanding, again, this is not an area of expertise for me. This is really a Department of Homeland Security issue, is that there are rules established for this that the administration has established. There are rules for people, for example, who can apply for asylum.
Well, let me just say I disagree with you totally. I think members of our State Department should be concerned about massive flows of people coming into our country illegally. And I think the use of the word migrant in some way adds some kind of problem with us for not accepting migrants as compared to people who've come here illegally when we have a very robust legal immigration system. Our legal, as I say, it's the best in the whole world. No one comes close to us and now we're supposed to feel guilty about not permitting another more massive flow, which basically would change the nature of our society as it has. And let me just note, Daniel Ortega and these folks and in Nicaragua, when they were removed from power, there was a relatively free system established in those countries. And when they came back into power with Mr. Ortega, all of a sudden, people began being murdered. And that's something I'm very proud that the Reagan administration did take the moves to make sure that that Mr. Ortega and his communist dictatorship was removed and replaced by a democracy. With that said, thank you very much for your service. And I do not believe that the president, again, the criticism that the president's hollowing out the State Department is ridiculous. The fact is that if he's hollowing out, we'd be complaining that he's putting his own people in. Well, when you have people with expertise like yourselves who are still in position that the president hasn't replaced yet, that's not something people with an open mind should complain about. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll go to Karen Bass of California.
Once again, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. I wanted to talk about the situation in Central America and specifically would like to focus on El Salvador. I was listening to your responses, Mr. Ambassador, about what we're doing to address the root causes, and it seemed as though your focus was a little bit on law enforcement. And we have spent a lot of time trying to address violence and crime-related issues with a strictly law enforcement strategy in the United States, and it hasn't fared very well. So I wanted to know what you have done beyond law enforcement. And I focus on El Salvador because there's a lot of discussion about MS-13 Mara Salvatrucha, which is a gang that started in my city, Los Angeles, and we exported this problem to El Salvador. And so I want to know what responsibility we are taking for our contribution to the problem in El Salvador.
Thanks for the question, and I think an element of this here should be fielded by my colleague from USAID. You know, our Central America strategy, yes, it has a component of law enforcement to it, but it is also designed to address the root causes of why people are leaving these countries or why people they seek to leave. And this involves working with governments to improve the business climate, the investment climate, to create economic opportunity. My colleagues at USAID and at our economic sections and our embassies are working to help these countries attract investment, attract and grow their economies so that people have less reason to have to leave.
Right, which is a catch-22 because it's hard to do that with the gang violence. So I want to know, since we exported the problem to El Salvador, I was wondering if we also exported some of our best practices. We actually do have best practices in the United States of how to address gang violence. There's a lot of examples of gang violence being reduced in a number of communities. Unfortunately, we have not really taken a sustained investment in communities, which is why we still have the problem. So my question is, are we exporting also some of our best practices in how to reduce gang violence?
Well, I can, one of my colleagues from the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement would be better equipped to answer that. We can take that back and get you an answer as to what specifically we're doing regarding gang violence.
Okay, that's great. I would appreciate that. Let me move on to another subject because like all of my colleagues, and I'm sure all of us in Congress are deeply concerned about these children. And I'm concerned that many of these children will never be reunited with their parents again. And so there's a number of examples of parents who are deported and then not being able to find their children, since we did this in such a haphazard way. And my colleague over there, Mr. Roybacher, when the Obama administration had the problem of unaccompanied minors, which is different than taking children away at the border, there was a big outcry about that and what was happening with those children. But my question is, I have heard of numerous examples of when the parents are deported. Number one, if they're fortunate enough to find their children, then what we are saying is that now you have to pay $1,500 to transport your child and a guardian to get your children back. And so I want to know if in the budget of USAID, the State Department, somewhere, it seems as though if we take the children away, then our government should be responsible for reuniting those families. I'm introducing legislation that makes our government responsible. I'm also very concerned that the children that are put in foster care, foster care is time limited. And so if you languish in foster care for more than 18 months, parental rights can be terminated, which is why I'm worried that some of these children may never find their parents again. And so I want to know if within the budget of USAID you are considering setting money aside to help facilitate the reuniting of these children that we took away.
Great, thank you. All of our funding is dedicated to working in the countries of the Northern Triangle on this issue.
Right, so the question is, are we setting aside money so that we don't charge the parents? We took the children away, and now we're charging them to get their own children back. You also mentioned, Mr. Ambassador, an information campaign to let people know not to come over here because we take their children. And I'm wondering if that's a massive PR campaign on radio, on TV, social media, or are we just doing it one by one?
I think what I said, or certainly what I meant to say, was that our public diplomacy in all countries is to encourage people to travel to the United States, whether that's as a tourist, as a student, or as a legal migrant, to come and travel to use legal methods to do so. We urge
Are we telling them that we're going to take their children?
I don't believe we're telling them that. We
Yeah.
are telling them that they need to avail themselves of legal routes of travel and legal routes, if should they qualify as immigrants, that they should pursue legal ways to do that.
This is going to go down in our history as a real moment of shame. Thank you. I give back my time.
We go to Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I begin, I want to thank the statements of Congressman Alberto Sires. His thoughtful observations are a fulfillment of the bipartisan promotion of democracy in the Western Hemisphere, which really reflects the bipartisanship, usually, not always, as we just saw, of this committee. So thank you very much for your service. Sadly, American diplomats in 2016 were subject to unexplained sonic attacks in Cuba. The Cuban dictatorship continues to deny knowledge or involvement in the attacks, but it's in a totalitarian regime with heavy static surveillance. What is the status of the investigation? Have we been able to determine the cause and source of the attacks? When can Congress expect a thorough report on the cause of these attacks?
Thanks for the question. This, as I mentioned earlier, this is something we find very troublesome at the State Department. The Deputy Secretary chairs a task force which is made up of various elements of the State Department, but also has an interagency component as well. We have ongoing FBI investigations. FBI has traveled on a number of occasions to Cuba to investigate the sites where this has happened. Our diplomatic security agents in the State Department are investigating. We have other elements who are participating now in this task force, like CDC and others, who are really examining all the data that we've thus far been able to bring together. But as of today, we still do not know what the cause of this is, nor who is responsible.
And I would tell you, with the technology we have today, Ambassador, this should be determined. And so I hope you will make every effort to proceed. And the next question, I'm grateful to have been co-chair of the Partners of the Americas program with the nation of Colombia from South Carolina. And we've hosted students from Colombia live with us. Two of my sons were in as exchange program to high school in Cali. Well, what an extraordinary country it is. I know that we are assisting Colombia in achieving lasting peace while also combating criminality and narcotics trafficking. The election of Ivan Duque gives the U.S. a reliable partner in combating cocaine production and a modified approach to the peace process. What do you see USAID, the State Department, doing to promote peace and security for the people of Colombia?
Yeah, from USAID's program is focused very much on peace. And in fact, we work predominantly in helping the Colombians and supporting their efforts to extend state presence in some of the areas that have not seen a government in sometimes decades. So we are actually working in over 50 of the hardest hit communities in Colombia to help the Colombians provide the local institutions that can provide basic services to people, as well as improve the environment to improve the rural economy. Specifically, when we work jointly with State Department INL, they on eradication and us on alternative development, it works extremely well, where the coca crop is eradicated, and then we come in with opportunities and an enabling environment, again, to have solid economic opportunities, jobs for people in the illicit economy.
Well, again, thank you, and what an extraordinary nation of 40 million people in Colombia. And then, sadly, another country that was dynamic, was democratic, is Venezuela. And we now see the consequence of what Margaret Thatcher said, and that is that socialism will work until you run out of spending other people's money. And so now they've converted one of the wealthiest countries, one of the most dynamic in South America, into a destitute, poverty-stricken, authoritarian regime. And so I'm really grateful for the sanctions by the president. What more can be done to try to help the people of Venezuela?
Well, as we talked earlier, we are mounting colleagues at USAID and the State Department, Bureau of Population Resources Migration are, providing humanitarian assistance to those people who have been driven out of Venezuela. We have regular outreach at the embassy with the opposition parties, encouraging them to get unified and form a unified opposition to the Maduro government. We have applied targeted sanctions to government officials and to Venezuela, and we're working with our partners in the region. We have pretty much, I would say, unprecedented support of other countries in the region who are really share our concern at what they see is a rich and democratic country descending into abject poverty and to effective dictatorship.
Well, thank you again, and working on behalf of the people of Venezuela. Mutual benefit to the hemisphere. Thank you.
Mr. Bill Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The President's made it very clear, and the administration's made it clear, the threat of MS-13 and the gang violence that's present in countries like El Salvador. This has been echoed in Homeland Security, which I'm also a member, where the administration officials have clearly said how dangerous and violent it is there, what danger it represents. So I'm going to just address a couple of the administration's response to this. Simply doesn't make sense. For instance, when it comes to the parents and their children fleeing this terrific violence in El Salvador, the President's response was to separate the children from their parents, traumatizing them, deporting them back to the crisis that they fled from. One of these people, Jessica, had 2 sons taken from her when she crossed in Texas in March. They were separated for 3 whole months. Jessica fled the brutal violence of El Salvador. She and her sons received death threats from MS-13, and she herself was beaten in front of her children by gang members. Yet, that's one response, is to separate the children. The other one that just does not have any semblance of consistency is to move forward on ending the TPS program for those countries like El Salvador that have, those countries have hundreds of thousands of people here legally, and they're being sent back because it's safer now. There's a definite contradiction with sending these people, many of them have been here for years legally to escape that violence, sending them back because now it's safer, yet at the same time, the administration is saying what an enormous threat it now is becoming. How can you reconcile such contradictions? These things simply don't make sense. They contradict each other by their own definition.
Thanks for the question. As I mentioned earlier, what our goal at the State Department is, in our view, is that we need to help these countries address the root causes of these problems. In that analysis, the root causes are corruption, impunity, lack of economic opportunity for people, lack of effective judicial systems, lack of effective law enforcement. Our Central America strategy, for which Congress was generous enough to give us $2.6 billion from 2015 to 2018, is working in all these areas in those countries.
I apologize for interrupting, but where you're going is to the root causes. That's great, but there are present dangers. Well, we could deal with the root causes of MS-13, but the President and the administration, they're not talking about the root causes of MS-13. They're talking about the present danger. The same kind of timeline should be used when you're looking at the present danger of these people. So I know what you're saying in terms of root causes, but you're avoiding the contradiction that's quite clear. That, these 2 instances of the response to this kind of violence contradict the fact that the violence is there that they're escaping from. You can't have it both ways. So I want you to address not just the root cause, but the present danger in that contradiction.
Again, we work with the tools that we have, both in USAID and the State Department, and these are the tools that we have to address these issues. If you're talking about other issues such as TPS, that is a decision that is taken by Department of Homeland Security. They have made that determination.
Well, I just think there should be better coordination. I sort of echo actually, the gentleman from California said, those are issues for Homeland Security. Sure, they're also issues for foreign affairs, and they're also issues for state. Just quickly, I'd like to echo the concerns in terms of the violence in Nicaragua as well. People like Father Jose Alberto Ediguez has had his life threatened. He's been targeted because of his work through the Jesuits and through education. I want to make sure people like that have been targeted, that be known to everyone. With that, I'd like to yield 40 seconds to my colleague from California, Ms. Torres. Thank you.
We go to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
No.
Yield me 40 seconds that he
Oh, yeah, that's right. Somebody was going to give you extra time. Norma Torres of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to be on the floor at 12 noon to present on a rule. I want to thank the department and specifically the White House on continuing to support CSIG in Guatemala specifically. While I agree that we should demand fair treatment for all refugees in Guatemala and here in the U.S. too, I hope that we don't lose sight of the significant progress that CSIG has made, not just carrying out investigations, but also helping to bring about important reforms and strengthening Guatemala's institution. That progress is real, and turning back that progress, in my view, is a big mistake. Ambassador Merton, I had 9 questions. They were yes or no questions for you regarding how the State Department, which I have accused in the past of head in the sand with the certification process in Honduras and now in Guatemala. Because of the lack of time that I have, I will submit them for the record, as well as a longer statement on CSIG. I do hope that you will respond to me the certification of Guatemala after the ongoing problems with the Congress trying to impugn themselves for their criminal behavior in stealing the purse of the people, to me, is something that we should be more careful about and how we go about. At the end of the day, us here in Congress have to be accountable, and we have to have a transparent process on how taxpayers' dollars is being spent. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I
Would the
yield back.
gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Because I'd like to add a quick observation here as well, because as our witness stated today, and I think Ambassador Nikki Haley reinforced this during her trip to Guatemala in February. CSIG is providing critical assistance to advance justice, accountability, and stability in the region. That's not an easy task. It's bound to be controversial, but CSIG is successfully chipping away at the culture of corruption. That said, there was an issue that was raised here by Mr. Smith, and as we know, the consequence of that is it's been adjudicated through the courts there in Guatemala, and that family is freed. This committee will continue to work, as I said, with the Senate, with the State Department, with the US-UN on reforms that will preserve the essential functions of CSIG, while responding to legitimate criticisms of overreach. And with that, I think without objection, the gentlelady's questions are going to be submitted to our witnesses, and we'll go to Ted Poe of Texas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. As the chairman mentioned, I am from Texas. We have a very strong and long-time history with Mexico, back even to the days of the 1500s when Mexico and Texas were part of Spain, or at least Spain claimed the territory. I'm a great believer in trading with Mexico. 10,000 18-wheelers a day cross back and forth our southern border. Thousands of people from both countries cross the border. And I think that the United States, as a nation, needs to refocus our attention to our next-door neighbors. I mean, we're all over the world. Well, there are 190-something countries, and we're in most of them. Not saying that's a bad idea. I'm saying that we need to focus on our next-door neighbors, Mexico, Canada, and then, of course, all of Latin America. I see, as many members of Congress have pointed out, that things are not good in the hemisphere, from Mexico south. Corruption, incompetence, violence, humanitarian problems with the nations, and as Mr. Saris pointed out, I think things are getting worse. I don't think they're getting better. I think they're getting worse. I mean, that's my position. As some other members pointed out, I'm a believer in NAFTA. But let's talk about some of the issues specifically with Mexico. There are a lot of foreign workers in the United States from Mexico. Going back to 2003, when Vicente Fox was president, he made this comment that was recorded in the San Diego Tribune. 20 million Mexicans in the United States generate a gross product that is slightly higher than the $600 billion generated by Mexicans in Mexico. Remittances are our biggest source of foreign income, bigger than oil, tourism, or foreign investment. That was in 2003. Most recently, the Pew Research organization has listed how much remittances from the United States go to other countries. In other words, foreign nationals working in the U.S. sending money back home. No surprise, Mexico is the #1 country that receives remittances from their workers in the United States back to their country. 28.1 billion, according to the Pew Research Company organization. Surprising to me, another issue, China's #2 as far as remittances go. So we're talking about 28.1 billion from Mexico, total amount $138 billion a year of remittances go back to foreign countries by their workers working in the United States. And my understanding is today, remittances are the #1 source of revenue to Mexico, except maybe for the sale of autos. So tourism and sale of oil is still behind remittances. So we're sending a lot of money, economic development money from the United States to Mexico and a lot of other countries. It's no surprise that the Mexican government has long supported more people coming to the United States by any means so that remittances can go back to their nation. So my question is, and this has been brought out by the administration as well, if we just think this through, if we can use the phrase subsidize these countries all over the world, shouldn't the United States charge a fee, 1%, for these transactions to occur? Specifically, foreign workers in the U.S. sending money back to Mexico and any other country where those remittances go each year, so that that part of that income generated in the United States stays in the United States, that the taxpayers don't have to pick up the difference of that $138 billion with a small fee, 1%, too. It makes me no difference. My question is, what's your opinion of that, Ambassador? And then I'll ask Ms. Lynch what your opinion is.
Well, I think, that's an interesting thought. I don't think it's, I think that could be potentially subject for legislation should you decide to go that route. I will say there are other countries in the hemisphere that do tax remittances that as they come in. Haiti is an example of that in the case that I know of. Beyond that, I don't think I'd choose to comment.
Okay. Ms. Lynch, you got an opinion? I'm about out of time. I am out of time.
I also think it's very interesting. I think we'd have to do further analysis. I know sometimes remittances are something that we look at as a way that we, reduce foreign assistance. So, but we would be, happy to look into this and analyze it.
I think Congress ought to consider that strongly so we keep some of that money in the United States. $138 billion, that's a lot of money even for us, Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Greg Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was this, I was found out about a Mr. Nazario Jacinto Corrello and his daughter, Filomena. His daughter was 5 years old. They fled to California from their village in the western highlands of Guatemala. Nazario was fleeing a local gang that had threatened to kill him. Nazario and his daughter encountered a Border Patrol agent and were promptly arrested at a Border Patrol station in Campo, California, and Nazario was told that he would be sent to jail. Filomena, his 5-year-old daughter, was taken by Border Patrol agents. Nazario said, "My daughter was screaming and crying, and so was I." Philomena was put in custody of the Office of Refugee Settlement, and she was transferred to my state, New York. Nazario subsequently abandoned his asylum claim and was flown back to Guatemala. And in the 5 weeks he spent in U.S. custody, he was never once able to speak to his daughter. Now, I visited a facility in New York, and one of the things that was noted to me that each and every one of the children that they had there also had their birth certificate, which tells me that they were not just trying to sneak in, they were truly trying to seek an asylum so they could have a hearing because they was running from danger. They wanted to stop to see a Border Patrol so that they could go through a hearing. They had some evidence of who their kids were, but they were treated like criminals. In fact, one of the children that was examined by the doctor, we were told, thought they had a toothache, but when, upon further examination, what was in the child's mouth was pellets from a bullet. That's what they were fleeing from. So, sometimes, I do feel inappropriate asking you questions because I really do acknowledge you and the service you've given our nation in the State Department and the diplomacy and how you, and I'm watching you, and I know you've got to answer some of these difficult questions. Problem is, I think that the President of the United States doesn't understand diplomacy and the value of the State Department. In fact, I was looking at him today when he was, and international organizations, when he was over talking to NATO, making all kind of horrendous statements and separating us from our allies there. I couldn't help but see the pain that Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison, when she had to admit this was right up Putin's alley, what was going on, and looking at General Kelly as he was looking away and drinking water and drinking water and drinking water as the president was making his statement. I say all that because my question to you was going to be about the United States and our affiliation with the OAS and the terms of the International American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, which obligates the states of the Americas to protect the right to life, liberty, and security for every human being, and to give protection to families, and to grant all children the right to special protection. And we know that a member of the OAS has filed a complaint to the OAS's Inter-American Commission of Human Rights concerning its this administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy. So, my question to you, and I know sometimes the president doesn't believe in multilateral and international organizations, does the Trump administration plan to respond to the OAS members' complaint to the OAS? Do you know?
Sir, I'm unfamiliar with that specific issue. I'm happy to take that back to my colleagues and get back to you with an answer on that.
Okay. Thank you. That's probably something that might be, as again, I said, it's difficult for me to question you because I know of your work. And some of it may be more appropriate for some other members of the administration. I think we touched on this, and again, to Ms. Lynch, who's the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator, I agree with you in the work that Administrator Green is doing and what the USAID does all over the region. And you're addressing the root cause of the problem. But these deportation, whether it's DACA or TPS, sending a lot of these folks, DACA kids who've never been there before, sending them back, does that help our relationship and the work that you're doing in trying to deal with the root causes of the immigration problems that we have at the border now?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We work very much within those countries, so within the Northern Triangle, in partnership with the interagency and also the host countries. So our role is really to support the host country and their efforts in receiving some of these folks. And so we've worked in the reception centers through the International Organization of Migration and IOM, and working with them to refurbish those centers and also make sure basic services are available to folks with the ultimate goal that they would return to their host and home communities, and there would be institutions there that would be stood up to also provide basic services and economic opportunities.
I thank you for your service.
Ted Yoho, Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate both of you being here. This is a timely hearing on the Western Hemisphere. I think we've pivoted away from that over the last, not just the last administration, but the last 15, 20 years, and it's time that we really put an emphasis on there, whether it's energy security for our Caribbean nations like Puerto Rico, our territory, or the U.S. Virgin Islands, or other Caribbean nations. Instead of them getting their energy from Venezuela, we're implementing energy from North America and allowing us to break the ties from Venezuela, and I think this is something that's imperative that we do. But I hear over and over again, and Ambassador Merton, you were talking about better governance. We've got to do more. Ms. Lynch, you were talking about we've got to do more and help these economies in that. The numbers I have pulled up, Central America, from Mexico down to Panama, there's roughly 171 million people. Over the course of the last 10 years, we've given $5.746 billion in foreign aid to El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and Panama. $5.746 billion. People are leaving the Northern Triangle because of poor governance. We're putting money into our aid program, USAID, MCC, OPIC, other organizations, to get good governance, to get economic development in those countries, yet we're not getting the return on that. I'd like to hear from both of you. What would you do? We've got to do something different. We can't do the same thing over and over again. And if I throw in the war on drugs, we spent over $2 trillion since the 70s on the war on drugs, and I think we're all convinced we're not winning the war on drugs, especially when you have Mexico with 72,000 plus acres of poppy fields, which goes right into heroin, which comes right into my country. And then you look at Colombia has more cocoa planted today than we did with the drug cartels. And so I want to know from you, what do we need to do as a nation, more specifically this committee, to direct foreign policy so we get good governance, we get a better economy, and we get allies that are on board with us that seriously want to fix this problem? Ambassador Merton?
Thanks for the question, and we certainly share your concern about all of the above. I think particularly the concern about the drug issue, which I'll briefly talk to. We have developed a good level of cooperation with Mexico, and one of the things that Secretary Tillerson started was discussions with Mexico on how we can work together to stop these transnational criminal organizations.
Let me ask you that, because we were down there with the chairman a couple years ago, and we want them to get better on their drug cartel and the drug production, but I didn't see the want and the desire there as much as we did. How do we get that desire with them? Do we pull money back? Do we threaten that? Do we threaten to block trade? Because we're not getting the results. And I hear what you're saying. Yeah, we want them to do this.
Yeah. We have a new government coming in Mexico in 5 months. A new president who's just been elected will take over. The Secretary Pompeo will be traveling there in the coming days, along with Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary Nielsen. We are going to start up those discussions again with this new government.
What's going to be different about those discussions?
Well, I think we have a new government to work with. We have to see where we can have leverage with them and what their interests are.
I feel like we have the cookie that they want. They want to trade. They want the access to our markets. I think we need to play hardball different than we have. Ms. Lynch, what's your recommendations?
Right. I do think we have considerable successes in the region. Specifically, I'll talk about in Central America, where we see on the governance side, for example, we see the governments of these countries putting their own resources against some of the objectives and goals that we mentioned at the outset.
Define success.
Define success is when a government, I would say it's three things: when a government puts its own resources to these issues, when the private sector invests, and when civil society acts as a watchdog and can hold their government
Which
accountable.
countries are you talking about?
I think we're seeing some of these successes in all of the Northern Triangle countries, whereby with our U.S. Central America strategy, they proposed a similar strategy, the Alliance for Prosperity, which aligns very well with ours.
Are we seeing a decrease in crime, a decrease in migration to our
Honduras
country?
is a good example, again, where we work very closely within the interagency and with the government of Honduras. In one area, the Riviera area of San Pedro Sula is a good example where INL works on the law enforcement side, we work on citizen security side, and together, yes, we have seen in past years the homicides reduced by over 60% there.
I'm out of time. I wish we had more time to talk to you. I appreciate both you being here. I hate to be so abrupt, but limited time, I'd like to talk to you further. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to thank both our witnesses for being here, and thank you so much for your service. And please, my comments are not really directed at you. And I have a lot of respect for what USAID does and the development that the State Department takes part in. So first, I wanted to start with, sometimes I think I'm just living totally in a bad episode of Saturday Night Live. I happen to represent beautiful Palm Beach, where Mar-a-Lago sits, and very interesting. Donald Trump asked permission to hire 78 foreign workers at Mar-a-Lago for the season. Doesn't he think there were American workers who could take those jobs? Oh, well, I thought that was very interesting. Anyway, on to another point, which I think is actually much more important, which is the fact that we are witnessing what I call a Trump-induced crisis at our Mexican border. We've heard many people comment on this, but I'm going to say it again, because until these families are united, I am not going to shut up about this. Mothers and fathers who are seeking refuge from extreme danger and persecution, they finally think they come for refuge, and what do? They get to our border, and this government steals their children right out of their arms. And you know what's happening now? Our government is so incompetent and so uncaring that they can't even match up most of these children. This is going to be a dark stain on this country with what's going on here. I went to the border a couple weeks ago with some other members, and look, I am the granddaughter of an immigrant. Probably everybody here is either the granddaughter or the grandson of an immigrant, right? What I saw was heartbreaking. And I'm just going to talk about meeting with the mothers who, listening to their excruciating crying because their children were taken from them. They hadn't seen them, didn't know where they were. One woman told me that she was told she was going to go to court for 48 hours, and then it's a month later, and she didn't even know where her child was. The other day, I had a little round table at the Guatemala Center in my where I live, and they do wonderful work there. And I heard from a young woman who told me that her cousin came over fleeing from gangs and violence in Guatemala, got to the border with her 10-year-old son. The 10-year-old son is now in Homestead in Florida, and guess where the mother is? She was deported back to Guatemala. Now, just got a little, it's a good thing I get these, you get these little alerts from your phone. This is what's happening now. Listen to this one. One mother had waited 4 months to wrap around her arms, 4 months to wrap her arms around her little boy. Another had waited 3 months to see her little girl again. And when it finally happened, Tuesday in Phoenix, the mothers were met with cries of rejection from their children. The children didn't even recognize the mothers. They were screaming for their caseworkers. And what I heard yesterday at this round table from child professionals, psychologists, was the trauma that these children, toxic trauma that these children are experiencing. Well, we can see that right now. Could you imagine? They don't even know who their parents are. So here's what I want to say. I mean, a lot of the questions I was going to ask have been asked and answered. I want to thank you for that. But I think there's no question, and I want to say this, building a wall is not going to solve the problem. Separating children inhumanely from their parents is not going to solve this problem. We have got to get into these countries and do the work. And I just saw that there's a proposal now to cut $180 million in funding for Central America. To me, that is just dumb. All right, that is really dumb. I don't have to ask you what you think about it. You're good people. I'm not going to force you to answer that. But, Mr. Chair, I just want to conclude by saying that we have to step up our efforts to try to get to the root causes, and we need immigration reform that Congress is responsible for, and we should do that as soon as we can. And thank you for patiently being here with us today.
Thank you, Congresswoman Frankel. We go now to Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing, and I'm sure there are other hearings where my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can discuss their desire to abolish ICE, but this is very important issues on the Western Hemisphere. With a lot of the issues we're seeing on the border, I think it drives home the importance of motivating people to fix their own countries and live in a better situation. If you look at our friends in Colombia, for instance, they went through decades of very difficult times, and with a little help from the United States and a lot of desire from their internal community, have really been able to not only just overcome their problems, but also be a refuge for people in tough areas like Venezuela. That's a good example of how we should be handling this issue so that the issue on the southern border does not continue to haunt us, and frankly, we don't have to abolish ICE in the process, as some of my friends want. Since September 11th, our security focus has been primarily geared towards the Middle East, where we've spent the past 17 years combating Islamic extremism. And during these years, many of our neighboring countries have faced political and economic instability and domestic insecurity. As a result of this instability and insecurity, thousands of people have migrated north and have arrived at our doorstep. And as I mentioned, I've worked with, or I have mentioned before, I've worked with ICE as a member of the Air National Guard, as well as Customs and Border Protection officers on our southwest border. And I know firsthand how those insecurities not only affect our nation's security, but also how they endanger the lives of those traveling north in search of freedom. And that's why it's imperative we regain focus on our own hemisphere. And I believe if we can establish a more stable and secure Western Hemisphere, we can usher in an era of prosperity that's never been seen before. And I'd like to briefly touch on a few of those countries. We've talked a lot about Venezuela. It's been the problem child of our region for the past 2 decades. In May, we watched as the corrupt Maduro regime swept the country's presidential election, which had been called fraudulent by the U.S. and our global partners. Last Congress, I introduced legislation that passed in the NDAA and would enhance the State Department's capabilities through the Global Engagement Center to identify and respond to propaganda and disinformation. So, Mr. Merton, given Venezuela's prosecution of political opponents and restriction of freedom of expression, can the GEC be used to amplify peaceful protests while highlighting the mass human rights abuses occurring in Venezuela? And what other tools do you have to handle that?
Thanks so much for the question. We've not been at all shy about calling out the Venezuelans and drawing attention to their abuse of the regime's abuse of its own people. And we have done that, in various fora, not least in the Organization of American States. And just at the recent summit here in Washington, at the OAS, we were able to get an unprecedented resolution in support of members of the OAS condemning Venezuela and putting them on a path to perhaps eventual suspension from that organization. Again, we will not be shy. We have used targeted sanctions to focus on those people who were responsible for tormenting the Venezuelan people.
Can you answer those specifically about if you see a role for the Global Engagement Center in this area?
I'm not an expert in that particular thing, and I would be happy to take that back and get you an answer on that.
And when you talk about the, what's been done in OAS, can you talk about the benefits of removing Venezuela from the OAS that you see?
We have discussed that, as I said, in the resolution that was passed by unprecedented support of countries representing over 90% of the population of the hemisphere, that puts us on a path to consider suspending Venezuela from the OAS.
And after Argentina's economic collapse in 2001, we saw anti-American administrations led by populist regimes drive the country in and out of economic despair. However, in 2015, under the new leadership, a pro-West, pro-business president, the Argentinian government settled their debts and opened Latin America's third largest economy for business. Still a lot of work to do, specifically in helping the country's poor and combating a growing narco-trafficking network, but Argentina's showing a lot of promise. Supporting governments in Latin America that shun socialist and repressive policies and support Western values should be one of our top priorities. But what concerns me is that in the past, Argentina has clawed out of an economic collapse only to spend more money than they are able to collect through taxes and trade, resulting in new depressions. So does state or USAID have any programs geared towards economic growth or making that government more efficient in how they spend their money?
Well, you know, Argentina has a relatively new president that we've engaged with, and we are very supportive of his market-oriented reforms. I think in our analysis that absent reforms generated from inside the country, that realizing their own shortcomings in previous legislation and mistakes that they've made in the past is the way that they're going to find the proper way forward. So we are very very optimistic about their approach to resolving their own problems.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for your testimony today. You know, many Americans and many around the world have been shocked by the Trump administration's use of family separation, separating young kids from their parents as a deterrent, what the administration would consider a deterrent to having people attempt to come here, including those who are seeking asylum legally to the United States. And a few weeks ago now, I was one of the members of Congress who went down and visited two of the centers who are keeping these kids. One of them is what is called a tender age shelter, and it's called Casa Presidente in Brownsville, Texas. And myself and Sheila Jackson-Lee and a few others held an 8-month-old named Roger who had been separated from his family. The staff told us they believed that he came with his sister because his mother had died. There was a 1-year-old girl named Leah who was also in the room with us. What role does the State Department play in the reunification of these young children?
Sir, thanks for the question. As I believe I've said in earlier questions similar to this, you know, we work in countries with our host governments. We work in places like Central America to try and eliminate the root causes of this.
Well, but I mean specifically, when parents, some of these parents have been deported now, is the State Department involved if they're back in the Northern Triangle countries and trying to get their kids back? Is the State Department involved at all? Because HHS is not in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador.
I'll be honest with you, I am not sure that our consular officials are involved in that process. I can take that back and get you a clearer answer on that, but I'm not aware.
I hope that you will, and I'll submit my question for the record because I'd like to know of the State Department that deals with other nations, and of course our domestic agencies here, whether they can represent to the American people that none of these children has died or been severely injured while in the custody of the United States government. That's my question. I'd also like to echo the comments by Representative Engel and also my colleague, Congresswoman Torres, about CICIG and the work that it's doing to fight corruption in Guatemala. And although I think it's fair to always be critical of any organization and take a critical look, I think it's important when we think about helping these countries get back on their feet to make sure that we have an organization that's trying to root out corruption and really restore the rule of law. Let me ask you this, because Congressman Kinzinger spoke a minute ago about making sure that countries fix the things that are wrong with themselves. And I agree. I think that the best antidote to having many people want to come to the United States who are undocumented is to make sure that the economies, to work with the nations to the south, to make sure that the economies there are strong. But let me ask you, if you're Mexico and there is the United States and an incredible demand for drugs coming from the United States, what strategy is going to be successful to completely root out the trafficking of drugs to the United States, where you have a huge demand for it? And because Mexico is not Colombia, which obviously is in South America, but is basically got a 2,000-mile border with the United States. So in other words, it's a geographically, it's a central country for drug trafficking routes. How do they combat that?
This is not exactly an area that I have expertise. In terms of domestic demand, my understanding is that the administration is putting together policies to look at fentanyl and look at ways that we can reduce people's use of these drugs. In terms of working with other countries, which is where we operate, the State Department, we have excellent cooperation with Mexico and with other countries in the region, including Colombia, to work with them to reduce the amount of these things that they produce, that they prosecute those who are responsible. We, as I mentioned earlier, we have this working group with the Mexicans on combating, and Central Americans combating transnational criminal organizations. This is ongoing work. It's important work, and we're hopeful that it will ultimately be successful.
And my last comment, and the reason that I pose that question is because as we try to help them figure this out, I think for them, if you're a relatively poor nation where the rule of law is not what it should be, and there is incredible corruption, and you've got people who are not making much money, very poor, who are basically tempted to go into the drug trade or be part of the drug trade, and there's an incredible demand right up north for those drugs, the challenge of rooting that out is gigantic. I yield back.
Mr. Garrett, Tom Garrett, Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. I want to ask a series of very brief questions because I have a finite amount of time. I want to start with your understanding of the nature of the hearing today. The hearing that I was briefed on was entitled Advancing U.S. Interest in the Western Hemisphere. Is that your understanding as well? Okay, and you all are from the U.S. Department of State, correct? Okay, and yet it seems about half the room is focused primarily, almost exclusively, on separations of the border. Is that correct? A lot of questions on that. And so in the Department of State, do you all have oversight of HHS? Okay, do you have oversight of DHS?
We do not.
How about USCIS?
No.
How about USCBP?
We do not.
How about Customs and Border Patrol? I'm sorry, how about ICE?
We do not.
So none of those are within your purview, and yet you've, quote, gotten a lot of questions on that subject matter. It's amazing to me how well some people talk off of talking points. In fact, right now, the number of people under the age of 5 who we think are separated from their families is just over 100, and yet, quite candidly, just off of the pre-planned talking points, we've covered about 14% of their cases in this committee hearing today. That's amazing. But what we've covered 0% of, and pardon me while I go on a little bit of a discourse here, are the roughly 4,000 Americans killed every year by unlicensed drivers who are here illegally. In other words, mathematically speaking, and we can't quantify these numbers because while we know about 13% of all highway fatalities nationally are caused by people who are here illegally, we don't quantify highway fatalities specifically by immigration status. However, what we do know is in the 10 states where you're licensed to drive regardless of your legal status, Maryland, California, et cetera, the number of highway deaths caused by people here illegally is closer to 14.5%. And so I guess if we looked at the numbers and we compared the number of people who are under the age of 5 who we think are currently separated from their families, there'd be about 40 Americans permanently separated from their families every single year for every one of them, but nobody's talked about that. And you all are from the State Department, and again, my condolences and gratefulness for you being here, but we've just determined, and I wish that I'd gone earlier in the hearing because maybe we could have saved some time, that you're not responsible for HHS, DHS, USCIS, USCBP, or ICE, which a lot of my friends across the aisle seem to want to abolish. So I apologize vicariously for the waste of your time. And I want to cover another thing real quickly that might be further within your purview. My good and distinguished colleagues and friends across the aisle, to include Mr. Meeks, Mr. Keating, Mr. Engel, Mr. Sherman, Ms. Bass, and Ms. Frankel, all have talked about horrific occurrences of gang violence in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and Mexico. And it really gives me pause because I don't think that everyone in these countries are violent gang members. Do you all, based on your experience? The Northern Triangle has lots of good people, right? They're not all gang members, right?
Of course.
And yet we've heard horrible stories. In fact, we heard about Jose and Brian, whose mom was raped and murdered, and they came to this country because they were afraid that, and I quote, the same thing might happen to them. But all people in those countries, they're not bad people, right? There are some gang members in those countries, right? And some of the people who are there are good people, right? Likewise, though, what we haven't heard of is that any gang members might ever leave those countries and come here. Now, I understand that it's somewhat beyond the scope and purview of the responsibilities of the Department of State, but do we have reason to believe that some of the people who might come into this country illegally could also be gang members? Could that be? I mean, mathematically speaking, just give me a wild guess.
I mean, I don't think, certainly we at the State Department don't know.
Do you think it's possible? I mean, you're risen to the level of ambassador. I'm just asking you to posit.
I mean, in the realm of possibility, I mean, a lot of things are possible.
Right. Okay. And we've heard that a wall is not the solution, but just like a door being closed and locked might prevent someone from coming in a room, but doesn't always prevent someone from coming in a room, it might also be part of a solution while it's not a panacea. So I continue that it's remarkable to see this concern for these just over 100 people under the age of 5, but not within the purview of the Department of State, nor the scope of identifying and addressing, let me see, U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. What is it that you'd like to have been asked about today very quickly that you haven't been asked about because nobody in this room seems to want to talk about the subject matter while you're here? Mr. Merton, Ambassador.
Sir, I think the questions we've got today are relevant to...
What is it that you'd like to have been asked about? What question would you like me to ask you?
Well, I would like you to ask me about the situation in Haiti.
Outstanding.
I know reasonably well.
I got 20 seconds. Please go over the situation in Haiti, and I apologize for having been distracted. There are people who are running for election. They got goals here. What do they want to do?
Sure. Very quickly, we're very disturbed by the recent unrest in Haiti. We are happy to see that the Haitian police and the Haitian government have been able to reclaim control of the streets. We hope that the Haitian government continues to work to pacify the situation, the political situation in the country. And in Haiti, we really see that the answer to why people are out on the streets upset, rioting, is because there is a lack of economic opportunity. And this is something we drive home with them at every possible opportunity. They need to attract investors who want to come to Haiti. And there are investors who want to come to Haiti. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd yield back.
We appreciate the State Department. Myself and another colleague here was on the phone over the weekend with a situation room there dealing with some of our constituents who were in harm's way in Haiti. We appreciate the State Department's efforts to get that resolved. And we also, Ambassador, appreciate very much your expertise in Haiti and all the time you spent there. We're going to go to Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I hope you don't find my question a waste of time, but thank you for being here. And I would just say there's a lot of things, a lot of ways people get killed that we don't talk about here, like gun violence prevention. Just had to say that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important as we hold these hearings to remember the young families who are escaping violence in Latin America and traveling to the land of opportunity. A young 14-year-old girl from El Salvador, identified by her initials, VFB, arrived in the United States in May with her mother fleeing violence after her stepfather was murdered in a church. The two of them fled to save their lives. At the time of their arrival, our government announced the implementation of a zero-tolerance policy. As we watched the consequences of this policy unfold, we saw thousands of children, as we've talked about, being separated from their parents, and she being one of them. Believing that she was being taken to give a bath, VFB was instead being lured away from her mom, not aware that she would not see her mom again. After being transferred to a shelter in Connecticut, the girl's mother remained detained in Encino, Texas. Finally, after 39 days, the young lady could hear the comfort of her mother's voice when she was finally allowed a 10-minute phone call. And now in July, VFB and her mother are still separated. We must get to the root problems that are causing increased migration, with families giving up everything for the chance of a better life, just like you talked about what we need to do in Haiti. The United States must do more to push for change on the ground in these countries. That's why I was so disappointed by the State Department's decision last year surrounding the Honduran election. In November, the State Department chose to certify Honduras's conditional funding, meaning you provided the Honduran government with direct U.S. funding just days after a disputed election with the Organization of American States Secretary General Luis Almagro eventually concluded was characterized by irregularities and deficiencies with very low technical quality and lacking integrity. President Hernandez has said he would move forward with electoral reform, yet he has done very little to date. In the past, he has also said he would remove the military police from the streets, yet there is still no timeline to do so. What is the State Department doing to pressure the Honduran government to make electoral reforms and to take the military police off the streets? And also, what leverage do you have given how quickly you certified the Honduran government after its disputed election? Thank you.
You know, on the Honduran certification, my understanding is that that is a process that it takes some time to do. I know we do certifications for Haiti and other countries. You know, the determination was made in the building in the State Department ultimately by the Secretary of State that they had met the criteria for certification, and that's why we recommended that.
Can you share some of the criteria that they?
I can't speak to the exact criteria for Honduras. That's not an area I work with on a daily or weekly basis. Regarding the idea of military, you know, servicing as police, it is unfortunate legacy in many countries in the hemisphere where military perform police functions. In general, our view is that that's not a good thing, that there is a role for military and there's a role for police, and we believe that those two should be separated.
And do you know if there's a timeline to do something about the police on the or the military?
I don't know that there is a timeline. No, ma'am. Sorry.
And also, is there general certification criteria, or is it something different for every?
My understanding is that for every country there are, and maybe some of you could speak to, there are different criteria that are established, usually by the appropriators.
Yeah, and we can get the specific criteria for you if you'd like.
I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Believe it or not, I yield back early.
Thank you. We go to Paul Cook, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to apologize for being late to the committee. I had a markup in natural resources. I want to thank you for being here today. Ms. Lynch, it's good to see you again. Our committee that we went down, we had 9 members that went to the Summit of the Americas, and you spent a lot of time with us, and really, really impressed with what you're doing in many of the countries. Also saw some of your work in Egypt. So thank you for being here. My questions, Mr. Ambassador, I did want to address the Peruvian agrarian bonds. And this is something that's been bouncing around for a while. It affects San Bernardino County. This is to resolve the claims of many of my constituents. These are land bonds, as they're known in the, they've been floating around for long years and directly affected many of the pensions plans in San Bernardino. The role of the government right now is they don't want to address it. They think that this happened 50 years ago and that this was under a different regime, and they are not, they just don't want to address it. And I keep pushing it on them, and I get some pushback. So I'm hoping you can kind of help me out with that. Are you familiar with it at all, or?
I'm generally familiar with the case, yeah, not with the specifics, however.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about, when we were down there, we had a weekend trip, as I said. It was a great Codell. It was short-lived. It was only a weekend, basically. On Friday, came back on a Monday, and we met with 21 countries. And I got to be honest with you, I came back just exhausted, but never learned so much in my life. But one of the things on the tail end of it, we met with 9 of the Caribbean countries. And you hear the same thing over and over and over again, that the United States has kind of forgotten, ignored the Western Hemisphere. Same thing. And even more so in the Caribbean, and even more so with some of these smaller countries. And it's no wonder that some of the very small ones, and not just Caribbean countries, they're susceptible to some of the economic manipulations that the Venezuelan government is making in returns for rebates on oil, and this is going to be a continuing problem. And you have to do the math in regards to the OAS. Each one of these countries has one vote, same as the United States. You add them together, and whatever changes you want to do in the OAS that's going to affect you, it ain't going to happen. At least I'm not very good in math. I'm not very good in a lot of things, but something we've got to talk to these countries in the Caribbean. One of their big concerns, hurricanes coming. Every year, we're going to have a hurricane. We're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And here we go again, trying to get aid down there, whether it's Puerto Rico isn't a country, it's territory, as you know, but here we go again. Now, I'm from the military. I know how successful pre-positioning equipment is. And we had talked about this, pre-positioning many of these supplies, have command post exercises where we go through the drill when it happens, whether it's in our own southern states or in the Caribbean, so we don't start from scratch like this, because we know it's going to happen. So I would hope that we agendicize that, and I think my staff has kind of mentioned that to you, that this was a big, big issue with our committee, and just don't want to, we're going to keep pushing that at all. The other thing I wanted to just ask you in terms of, I know that Secretary Pompeo is interested in Mexico and everything else, but do you get that same feeling that, hey, we have to start paying more and more attention, because there's a lot of countries down there. We've got China, we got Iran. Ambassador, I didn't mean to talk so much, but if you could kind of address that absence of attention to the area.
Yeah, thanks for your comment and question, sir. I would respectfully disagree that we have been neglectful of our neighbors in the hemisphere. We have a whole bureau of people that work on a daily basis with this. USAID has a large bureau that works with them on a daily basis. We've had the vice president who's traveled to the region several times already. We have, regarding the Caribbean, HR 4939, which has been the guiding
I don't mean to cut you off, but the chairman's going to cut me off anyway. The only thing I'm going to say is perception is reality.
Understood.
And if you poll those countries down there, their perception is they've been ignored. And that's all I'm going to say. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Cook. We go to Dina Titus. Lovetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to agree with Mr. Cook. I appreciate your optimism, Mr. Merton. You've said it in your opening statement, and now that we have these great bonds and that nothing is more important than our relationship down there. But actually, history tells a very different story. Our relations with Latin America over the years at best have been benign neglect, and at worst have been shoring up, either with troops or resources, governments that practice state terrorism. Now we are ripping children from the arms of their parents, and current policy is so bad and relations so abominable that the OAS recently unanimously passed a resolution condemning our behavior. So I don't really think that's anything to brag about. I would go back to something, though, that was discussed hours ago. You brought up, Ms. Lynch, that we have a policy that tends towards self-sufficiency, but there are other players in the region who have a policy that's more about dependency. This worries me because I have seen it all over the world. We have seen it in Southeast Asia, we see it in Africa, we see it in Eastern Europe. The U.S. pulls back, we create a power vacuum, in moves Russia, in moves China, and now certainly there are examples of that in Latin America. We heard about the tanks that Russia is selling in Latin America. We know that they're increasingly meddling politically and economically through propaganda. I wonder, have you asked the president if he's going to bring this up with Mr. Putin when he meets with him next week, that this could be causing a problem, the tanks and the other activities? They've supplied a global navigation satellite system in Managua. They've got joint counter-narcotics center there. I mean, they're moving in when we're not doing much. Also, let's be specific about China. Latin America is now their second largest destination for Chinese investment, and they are the largest trading partner for Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru. So this is not something minor. They're putting $2 billion into the ports in Peru as part of a $10 billion Chinese investment in energy, mining, and shipping, and telecommunications. So even if it is creating dependency, when they are offering those kind of things, it's kind of hard for us to compete with it or counter it with the policy, as you described, Mr. Merton, of telling them it's not a good idea to do this in the long run. Well, they're interested in the short run. So I would say, in addition to having talked to the President about Russia's involvement, how can we possibly compete when we have a diminishing budget? USAID, they want to cut that back all the time. It's already very small. We've got kind of a demoralized, understaffed State Department. You've got a president who insults our allies. You've got a policy of zero tolerance at the border. How can we compete with the competition down there to build those strong relations that we need?
Well, I do think we do have strong relations, and we have a history of engagement. We have a history of shared values with all the countries in the hemisphere, and particularly our close neighbors, Canada, Mexico, Caribbean countries. We have diaspora communities here in this country who contribute to our national well-being. So I think that we have a lot to offer. We also have, aside from all the good things that our colleagues at USAID are doing throughout the hemisphere, and our colleagues from the state INL are doing, we also have a very vibrant private sector, and I think that while our private sector does well exporting and trading with Latin America, we also have a lot of investment there, and I think that is a good vector of bringing economic opportunity and hopefully hope to these places.
Well, I agree with that, and I think the USAID does a wonderful job. I think they're one of the best agencies. We get more from them by giving them less than any agency I can think of. But as far as the commercial aspect, we're not even being very helpful there, because the one party in this Congress doesn't even support the Import-Export Bank, which would help with some of the investment there. So on what front are we really being successful? And I know you have to answer that in a positive way, and I appreciate that, and I'd like to be optimistic too, but I think we need to be realistic as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just make clear for the record that after being unjustly jailed for 3 years, Igor Bitkov and his wife, Irina, who spent 3 months unjustly jailed, and their daughter, Anastasia, another 3 months for being unjustly jailed. Igor got out on bail, but they were told they're not free. They are under house arrest. I just confirmed it again within the last couple of minutes with their attorney, that they are under house arrest. Significantly, on May 23rd, and I mentioned earlier before, in terms of the chronology, right before, 2 days before my hearing, which was in this room, the court ruled and allowed them out of jail. That was the Constitutional Court. That wasn't enough for CSIG, however. On May 23rd, CSIG went back to the Constitutional Court in yet another action against the Bitkovs.
This would be the third.
Yes.
The third time.
And so there's a pattern, I think, here. On June 21st, the Constitutional Court, in contrast to its previous decisions, exonerating the Bitkovs under the Palermo Protocol. I remind my colleagues that under Palermo, and we're talking about migrants. These are asylum seekers, a family that was escaping the impunity of Vladimir Putin and his cronies. Article 5 makes clear that migrants shall not become liable to criminal prosecution under the protocol for the fact of having been the object of conduct set forth in Article 6 of the protocol. And then it is clearly pointed out that producing a fraudulent travel or identity document, procuring or providing or possessing such a document. So, the Palermo Protocol couldn't be clearer, and anyone who doubts that they were escaping a tyrannical action against them just look at the record. It couldn't be more clear. So the Constitutional Court now has allowed a C6 action because the Bitkoffs got false driver's licenses and credit cards. Again, they wanted to change their identity. We have witness protection in this country when someone wants to change their identity in order to escape the mob or the mafia, in this case, the Russian mafia. And now they're bringing another action. What is, and I would ask with respect, what is the driving force behind CSIC after first being part of an action that got 19 years for Igor, 14 years in prison for his wife, and 14 years in prison for their daughter? I mean, that's what the judge found. That's what the court found. What is the driving obsession here? I mean, when you say there's been an investigation, you found no evidence, how deep was that investigation? How much was looked into the Russian connection here? You know, we know for a fact that thousands of business women and men in Russia routinely have their businesses taken away from them. I cut my eye teeth on Russian human rights issues in 1982 in my first term on a trip to the Soviet Union on behalf of Soviet refuseniks, Jews who wanted to emigrate, including people like Yulika Sharansky, great people, who then they had all of these false charges brought against them, often were sent to psychiatric prisons or places like Perm Camp 35, and I actually visited Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains just a few years later and heard horrid tales of men who had been taken and tortured by the Russians, in that case the Soviets. But now we have a continuation of that, and again, the Russians went looking for the Bitkoffs, took them several years, and then they found them, and had a willing partner called CSIC to join in the efforts, and it's all laid out in nauseating detail, unfortunately, and yet there are people who suggest this is an overreach on our part, trying to raise these issues. And I said it before, Bill Browder, he is the subject of attacks unrelenting by the Russian government, unrelenting. I was in a bilateral at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly as head of the United States delegation these last 5 days in Germany. And at that meeting that was chaired by Peter Tolstoy from the Soviet side, from the Duma, was some of the people who had been held to account under the Magnitsky Act in terms of their wrongdoing. They were sitting right at the table and took great umbrage at the Magnitsky Act. They don't like it. We believe in sanctions. We believe in personalizing them as a way of really trying to inhibit bad behavior and hold to account. But now we have a situation where a family who is at grave risk, in my opinion, their physical safety is my overriding concern. I want to keep them out of prison because I think they have done no wrong. They have done what any of us would do for our families if a gangster group came after us, and certainly changing a passport to a new name, certainly having a driver's license with a different name, and now CSIC is going after them because of their driver's license. I mean, it begs credulity. It's beyond the pale as to why. Can you tell us why?
Sir, I can't speak to the particularities of how CSIG works internally. I will say, in terms of beyond what I told you about the Bitkoffs before, our embassy has engaged with the Guatemalan government. We've got assurances from them that they will not send the Bitkoffs back to Russia.
If I could interrupt, would the gentleman yield?
And there is no extradition.
How about the son? Since the Russian banks are now asking that the young son, who's maybe under 3 years of age, be returned from Guatemala to Russia. Do you have assurances of that too?
I hate to admit this, but you've exhausted my expertise in this subject, and rather than mislead you, I think I'd rather get back to you.
The gentleman would yield. Ambassador, I would suggest in a situation where you're looking at sentences of 17 years, 14 years for the wife, 14 years for the daughter who had been, after the bank tried to, after certain individuals in the bank tried to take control of the company, had been abducted and raped in St. Petersburg for 3 days, for her to get 14 years, for the younger son to be in a situation where the Russian government is trying to have him return to Russia. And given the past pattern of behavior, you would have to ask yourself, when these sentences are longer than sentences for drug trafficking, for murder, for even terrorism in country, there is something a little unusual about the particulars of this case. And that is why, when I said earlier, we're going to work with US-UN on investigations here in terms of this set of circumstances, it is, I think, incumbent upon all of us to dig a little deeper and get a little bit more understanding of this case. And I would ask you to do that and then get back in touch with Chairman Smith and myself and other members of this committee that are interested, because at the end of the day, our goal is to have CSIG work effectively. They're in an environment where they're taking on corruption. But the one thing you and I know is that the Russians try to influence the outcome in any case where they go after anyone who tries to flee their government's control. And if you ask yourself, how far will they go? Apparently, poison by radiation is not out of bounds. We know of 2 cases where that was done in the UK. So when you have an arm of the state, a state bank, bringing a case in Guatemala after bringing a case where they had previously, anyway, I've exhausted our time, but I think Chairman Smith made the point, and I would just reiterate it. At the end of the day, we want CSIG to be effective. For that to happen, we need the reforms in place. And but again, I see Mr. Cook here. Were you seeking time?
No, I came back in because we're planning a trip as part of my committee to Guatemala. And obviously, this is a huge, huge issue. I'm one of the, we're all concerned about it. I know, Ms. Torres, it's something that we're concerned, and I share the chairman's feelings about Russia and their history. And so this is something that's not going to go away, and obviously this is going to be our top agenda when we go down there. Thank you.
If I could just conclude, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, yes.
And I thank you for
yield
your
back.
comments. To the Bitkoffs, they live with the sword of Damocles hanging over their head every single day. I mean, they got very poor treatment in prison. They had a huge, huge SWAT-like team take them to prison in the first place, totally beyond all reason. And what that has done, especially to Anastasia, who was abducted, and this is the way the Russian oligarchy, the Russian leadership works. They go after businessmen and women who are successful to fleece them, and if you don't play ball, they set examples for certain people. To think that CSIG has anything to do with that absolutely undermines their mandate. Who doesn't want to get rid of corruption? Every single one of us. But if personnel is policy, which I think it is, and there are any corrupt people within the organization called CSIG, that needs to be weeded out, and beyond that, not just weeded out. Anyone who is complicit in any of this, that's why I've asked very specific questions about collusion, they need to be prosecuted. And no games. I thank you.
Okay, with that, we thank the witnesses for being with us today, and we stand adjourned.